Okay,
What
I'm
stuff are
from
you thinking?
Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I went to the University of Wisconsin in Madison in the 60s. That's where I became a film buff. I got interested in film through seeing Citizen Kane in a film class, and I was a journalist, and my parents were journalists, and I thought I would do that for a career and write novels. And then I saw Kane, and I wanted to be a filmmaker, and I wrote screenplays for about 20 years in Hollywood, and won a Writers Guild Award and I got a couple of Emmy nominations. And but I've been writing books since I was 15. When I was a kid, I was a big baseball fan, and I was selling hot dogs and Cokes at the Milwaukee Stadium for the Milwaukee Braves baseball team and the Green Bay Packers football team when Vince Lombardi was the coach. And I wanted to know more about baseball slang, and there wasn't really a good book on the language of baseball, so I started writing one when I was a sophomore, the summer of 1963, and I didn't really know how to write a book, and I just sort of taught myself by doing it. It took about 3 years, but I didn't actually get that published until 17 years later. My father was an old sports writer, and he kept sort of urging me to publish it. So in the late 70s, I updated the book and got it published. But so that kind of got me on the book writing kick, and I've been doing it ever since. And when I got to college, when I discovered Orson Welles, I started writing a critical study of him. And he was from Wisconsin and had lived in Madison, which I thought was interesting. And at the time, there wasn't much written on him in English. Now there are many, many books on him, but mine was one of the first. And so I spent 4 years studying him and writing a book about his films, a critical study. And through that, I got to meet him because my first visit to Hollywood in 1970, by then I was a journalist working for the local newspaper. My Wells book was virtually finished, and I was writing a biography of a critical study of John Ford with a friend of mine, Michael Wilmington. Ford was my favorite director and still is. And so I arranged a meeting with Ford in Hollywood in 1970, and I went there not knowing that Wells was in Los Angeles, and through the young director Peter Bogdanovich, who I admired, he was writing a book on Wells at the time. He introduced me to Wells, and I was really surprised because I thought Wells was in Europe, and I had been wanting to meet him for a long time. And what even surprised me more was he said, "We're about to start making a film. Would you like to be in it?" So I was kind of stunned because I'd never really acted. He put me in a film called The Other Side of the Wind, which I was in for 6 years. And he was, I think, the greatest actor's director in the history of movies, and here I was, this non-actor, working for him. So I just kind of did whatever he told me to, and it was kind of my film school, because when I was in college, we only had 2 film courses. And the way I taught myself about films, I ran the Wisconsin Film Society, and we showed a lot of films on campus. We had many, many film societies, and it was a wonderful place to see films. But I learned a lot about the art of making films from working with Wells and watching him shoot for 6 years. And this film that I'm in is a satire of Hollywood, sort of in the Easy Rider era, as we now call it, when the young directors were taking over. And it's about an old director who's trying to make a comeback in that period, played by John Huston. And I'm supposed to be a young critic following him around, asking sort of silly film buff questions of this old guy. So I got to write my dialogue with Wells. He allowed the actors to collaborate on their own dialogue. So it was really an interesting creative experience. And the film still hasn't come out. It was never finished. He shot all of it, but he left it unfinished in terms of the editing. And there are still efforts underway to release it. And there were just stories about it in the press a couple weeks ago, but it's still dragging on the rights and the ownership, and it gets very complicated. It's a long story, but it's a kind of a legendary unfinished film. But I got to do it, which was great fun. So I've done many books since then. I've done 2 more books on Wells, and I worked for Variety in Hollywood as a reporter and critic, which helped me learn a lot about the business. And then I started writing biographies in 1984. I started writing a biography of Frank Capra, and I had written 5 American Film Institute Life Achievement Award programs for CBS, which were really my best experiences as a screenwriter, because I got to work with all kinds of great legendary people, not only the people who got the awards, who were Jimmy Stewart, Fred Astaire, Frank Capra, John Huston, and Lillian Gish, but all the people they worked with, you know, and their friends and stars and colleagues who came on the shows. I got to write their speeches and help put together the programs, and so those were great. And one of them was Capra, so I got to know him better, and I realized that there was a big story there that had been neglected, that he was not really the man people thought he was. They thought he was some kind of a warm-hearted liberal humanist, and he was actually a very conservative guy who was very bitter. And but the story I found out was that during the blacklist period he had become a secret informer and had been accused of being a subversive, which is ironic because he was really a very patriotic American. He was an immigrant from Sicily, but nobody's ever been more patriotic than Frank Capra in his films. So he was accused of being subversive because he had made films of social criticism in the 30s, and he had worked with a lot of liberal and left-wing writers, so he kind of panicked and turned in some of his colleagues, mostly writers, as suspected communists. And he did this secretly, and nobody knew about this, and I discovered this, and it sort of unlocked the mystery to me of why his career collapsed after World War II. He was a great filmmaker until he made It's a Wonderful Life, and then everything after that was downhill very precipitously. So that was a fascinating book. I spent 7.5 years on that, and since then I've done big biographies on John Ford, which took me a long, long time, and Steven Spielberg.
Right.
Yeah, I've been teaching here since 2002.
2002?
Yeah, I've taught courses off and on since the 70s, but I didn't get into teaching full-time until I came here. The job became available, and it's been very exciting for me to teach full-time. I'm still writing books, of course, while I teach, but it's very stimulating to work with students and get to exchange ideas with younger people. It keeps you on your toes. And I teach screenwriting as well as film history, so I get to use my expertise as a screenwriter. And I wrote a textbook on screenwriting, which is coming out next year, which is called Writing in Pictures, Screenwriting Made Mostly Painless, and mostly is in parentheses.